Good morning or afternoon, depending on when you're listening to this. This is your podcast on photosynthesis. So take out your photosynthesis notes sheet, and again, take your time when you're doing this. You can stop the recording whenever you need, but make sure you get all the information down. The first thing that we want to address before photosynthesis and cell respiration are the two types of organisms that there are on the planet. You're either considered an autotroph or a heterotroph, and I'm fairly certain that you all know what these two words mean. They're just fancy words for producers and consumers. So if you look at the word autotroph, these are the ones that are the producers, and they obtain energy from sunlight or chemicals. If you obtain energy from the sunlight, you go through photosynthesis. If you obtain energy through chemicals, that's what we call chemosynthesis. But some examples you can think of, you don't have to write all these down. I just get maybe one of them. But plants and other protists like algae or plankton or even some bacteria are the autotrophs. And these are important to drive a lot of the chemical reactions in our planet. And without the autotrophs, we would have no heterotrophs, otherwise known as the consumers. So consumers must obtain their energy from the other organisms. They consume or they eat or they obtain this energy from other organisms like animals or fungi. If we looked at the kingdom list, then you would see the only heterotrophs are animals and fungi and some protists. Protists is one of those kingdoms where we put a lot of it's like the junk kingdom. We just, if we don't know what it is, but it's a eukaryote, we put it in the protist kingdom. Forget these questions. So cells and energy. What do this is all about? This section is all about energy. How do we get energy from the sun into living systems, and what do cells actually use it for? So cells use energy for multiple reasons. For movement, anytime you move, you're using energy. Anytime you breathe, you're using energy. Use it for active transport. We just talked about this in cell transport, endocytosis and exocytosis, and ion pumps. Cells use energy to repair old parts. Cells use energy to make new parts. And cells use energy to transport food. And finally, to power chemical reactions. So again, if I'm going too fast, just pause the podcast and make sure you get some of these down. You'd be responsible on a test for just naming a couple of these. So just reviewing things that you learned back in middle school, what is the ultimate source of energy for all the organisms? Where does the energy flow start? It starts with Mr. or Mrs. Sun. The sun, that's where we get all our energy from. And so before we get into this whole process of photosynthesis, I want to back up and talk about a molecule called ATP. ATP is what eventually happens to the sun's energy. It is a energy molecule that living things use for to power the reactions, to get energy from the food that they eat or the sun that gets collected. Cells store energy in carbohydrates and fat, but then we use that energy to make ATP. Cells break down, of course, those carbohydrates and fats to form ATP and then use it for life purposes. So essentially, we eat, if you're looking at humans, for instance, we eat food to make ATP just so we can break it apart. Now, we'll go over in class the actual equation of how that actually works. Where do all the carbohydrates come from? Producers through photosynthesis. So producers collect sunlight, they make carbohydrates, and they either use those carbohydrates to make ATP or we consume the producers and make our own ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphates, right? An adenosine with 3 phosphates on it. So photosynthesis, some basics. If I gave you a plant and said don't kill it, make it grow, I'm fairly certain you all would be able to answer that question. What plants need for photosynthesis? Energy from the sun. They need chlorophyll, which is the pigment that absorbs the sunlight, carbon dioxide from the air or the water, and of course water itself. So an actual definition or description of photosynthesis: plants use sun's energy to combine water from the soil and carbon dioxide from the air to make glucose. This is the chemical formula of glucose. You need to get used to this chemical formula. It's just a generic form of sugar, C6H12O6. And then oxygen, of course, is a byproduct. And we'll get into how that actually works here in a few minutes. So again, back to another way of describing photosynthesis. It's a process in which energy and sunlight is stored in the bonds of glucose for later use. It's a process. I might even underline or highlight that word. It's a process which energy and sunlight is stored in the bonds of glucose for later use. When organisms need energy, they take the glucose, that energy, and make ATP just so, again, we can break it apart. Photosynthetic organisms like plants use this light energy to produce glucose, which can be used at a later time to supply energy needs of the cell. This is another way of saying it. I've given you 3 different ways to describe photosynthesis, and I think it's important to note they all say the same thing, but it's important to have these different ways of saying it because on the SOL, there is not one particular way you can describe photosynthesis. So I want you to be ready with the different ways that you can describe it. In science, there are equations just like math, and if you notice, there are no equal signs, there are arrows. On the left-hand side, we have the reactants, the things that react together. On the right-hand side, we have the products, what is produced. Don't worry so much about these number 6. All that is balancing equation. When you get into chemistry, you'll do lots of this, and all that means is the number of hydrogens on the left side have to equal the number of hydrogens on the right side. So if you write this equation down, energy plus water plus carbon dioxide gives you glucose and oxygen. Here's just a picture of the leaf structure where you can see how things can come in and out of the cells. That's not as important as the chloroplast structure. This is what the chloroplast looks like. Within the chloroplast, you have these thylakoid discs. They look like little pancakes, and that's where the chlorophyll pigments are actually located. The stroma is like the cytoplasm of the chlorophyll, and that's the space surrounding these thylakoids, and they contain the enzymes that are needed to actually run the photosynthesis. So if we look at chlorophyll, it's the green pigment common to photosynthetic cells. There are different kinds of chlorophyll A and B, that absorb different wavelengths of light. There's also things called carotenoids or carotenoids, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And that's what makes different plants different colors, like different colored flowers or different colored vegetables that you might pull out of the garden. This is often what we see when the leaves change colors in the fall. And we see those nice bright reds and oranges, and yellows. But just be aware that there are different kind of pigments that are going to absorb the light. And of course, chlorophyll itself absorbs all wavelengths of visible light except for green. That's what it means to be an absorbent or a pigment. Right? We see a reflection of the colors, of the green colors. Just like the carotenoids, if you see a red flower, you're not actually, you're seeing a reflection of the red sunlight. So looking at the pigments just in general, each pigment absorbs a different specific color of light. And again, we have different pigments here, different wavelengths of light, and they reflect. If we see a green color, that's just a reflection of green light. It absorbs all colors but green. Different pigments are present to absorb as much light energy as possible. And that's the job. It's like a magnet. They're just kind of sucking it all in and reflecting what it can. If we want to be real specific about how the light energy actually gets absorbed, the first step, the pigments are molecules that absorb light, and when the light strikes this pigment, an electron over here, you might be familiar with electrons and atoms, gets excited. And that's often what a photon, we kind of associate the photon with electrons. These energized electrons move further from the nucleus. Right? They get excited, they get heated up, and they start moving very quickly. And these excited molecules pass energy on to another molecule. And that's how we kind of get this photosynthesis process started. Uh, the specifics of photosynthesis happen in two steps, two reactions. And this might be a little different from fifth or sixth grade or seventh grade, whenever you talked about photosynthesis last. But these are the two steps: the light-dependent reactions, meaning that we need light, and the light-independent reactions, which means we don't need light. We often call that the Calvin cycle or the dark reactions. Either way would be fine. The light reactions, again, require light. Right, this is the first step. And these reactions occur in the thylakoid membrane in the chlorophyll. Remember, that's where the chlorophyll is located, in the chloroplasts. You have the chloroplasts, and within those chloroplasts, you have these little pancake discs called the thylakoids, and the chlorophyll is within those thylakoids. So light is absorbed by those pigments. You can see electrons get excited. That comes in, gets absorbed, electrons get excited. Right? This is where water is used. Water is used to make oxygen and those electrons. And so the electrons are used to make energy. Water, going back here just a little bit, you can see that water breaks apart. You have the hydrogens that are available, and you have the oxygen that is kind of passed on as is released as gas. So when we breathe in oxygen, we are breathing in leftover water molecules from plants. But be that as it may, the electrons are excited, and they're used to make these energy storage molecules like ATP and NADPH. The last step, of course, oxygen is released as a gas. So keep in note, the energy from the sun is now stored in these molecules, ATP and NADPH. And just looking at the most important points of this, light is required. We need pigments in the leaf to absorb the light. Water is used in this step, and oxygen and energy are produced in this step. So that's sort of, again, the summary of everything. But we still need to make something. We still have not made our glucose. Right? That is extremely important. That is what the plants are trying to do. So if we go on to the light-independent reactions, light-independent reactions occur in the stroma, which is like the cytoplasm in the chloroplast. It can happen under light conditions or dark conditions. It doesn't matter. Right? The light was already used in the first step. So the energy from the sun, again, is stored in ATP and NADPH from the light-dependent reactions, and they provide the energy so that carbon dioxide from the air can combine with hydrogen from the water to produce glucose. And just keep in mind, glucose is C6H12O6. So we have the C and the O's from the carbon dioxide, we have the H's from the water, and the energy in ATP and NADPH kind of combine these two together to make our sugar. Again, that's called the Calvin cycle. So here's sort of a complicated picture of how that all works. I'm going to show you a less complicated picture. This is going to be found in any kind of biology book, this one, this complicated picture of the Calvin cycle. But I think here's a better way of going over the processes. So here we have the light reactions, and we have arrows pointing in. We need light energy, we need water. Right, those two things go in at this point, and what comes out is ATP and NADPH. So all the energy from the light is within the ATP and NADPH, and then oxygen gets released as a gas. These H's right here on the NADP, that's from the water. The H's from the water go on to the NADPH's, right? And a lot of the other energy from sunlight is used for ATP. So now what we have to do in the light independent, carbon dioxide is absorbed, and the energy in ATP and NADPH puts those H's on the CO2 to make our glucose. Now, the interesting thing about all these cycles, things get recycled. So ADP, when ATP gets broken apart, we make ADP, When NADPH gets broken apart, those hydrogens go to the glucose. We're left with NADP+. Here's another version of what we just talked about. Light energy goes in, water goes in, ATP and NADPH are made, oxygen goes out. Right? Again, the hydrogens go from water to the NADPH. Oxygens in water go bye-bye. In the Calvin cycle, carbon dioxide goes in, glucose comes out, and ADP and NADP plus are recycled. So again, just looking at the equation here, going back to the equation, the water and the oxygens are in the energy or in the light dependent reactions. Carbon dioxide and glucose are in the light independent reactions. Last a little bit about the structure of the leaf. You have stroma and CO2. Stroma are little openings in the surface of leaves that allow gas exchange and water evaporation from inside the cell. And because dehydration can be a serious problem, sometimes the stomata actually close when the plant is under water stress. And when closed, carbon dioxide needed for the Calvin cycle cannot enter. So therefore, when it's closed, photosynthesis does not happen. That could happen under any water stress situations. So that concludes your notes on going back on photosynthesis. Make sure you take the photosynthesis quiz if I posted that on your class feed.